Hello, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to this event, 1 year later, the war in Ukraine and the MENA region. Let me start with some welcoming remark. The event is co-organized in partnership with the Middle East Institute and the Policy Center for the New South, whom I thank very much. And it's part of the year-long initiative that will lead us to the 9th edition of the Rome-Med Mediterranean Dialogues, the annual conference on the Med region, which is co-promoted by ISPI and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. We are approaching the anniversary, as you know, of the beginning of Russia's war against Ukraine, and we know that while, of course, Ukraine is clearly paying the highest costs of the war, this conflict has had many second-order effects at the wider European and global level. Among these, the war had a deep impact on the stability of Middle Eastern and North African countries, for instance, in terms of food security and increased inflation rates. But the war also had political implications for the MENA region. I think we have observed an overall need to balance among shifting alliances, except for countries, for instance, like Syria and Iran, that openly sided with Moscow. Most of the others have tried to maintain a neutral stance vis-à-vis the conflict, vis-à-vis this dispute, and between these two countries, two blocks that have been formed, the Russia on one side and the Western community on the other. Despite being long-standing partners of the US and having voted in support for the UN General Assembly resolution of March 2022, which was condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, many regional governments, many governments in the MENA region have indeed avoided blaming Moscow explicitly. There were also several instances of some countries that stepped up as possible mediators of the crisis, like Turkey, for instance, but not just Turkey. So today we are discussing the war's impact on the MENA local political context, on its long-lasting conflicts, instabilities, and the wider geopolitical equilibriums of the region. And we are doing so with three excellent experts of the region. May I have the pleasure to introduce you ABDELHAK BASSOU, Senior Fellow of the Policy Center for the New South, INTISSAR FAKIR, who is the Director of the North Africa and Sahel Program at the Middle East Institute, and JULIEN BARNES-DACEY, who is the Director of the Middle East and North Africa Program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome very much to our guests and friends. And before turning to them for first round of Q&A, let me just remind that you should be able to ask your questions in the Q&A function chat, and we will dedicate about 10 minutes after a couple of rounds of questions to Q&A from the audience. So please write down your questions and I will convey them to the speakers later on. So let us get into the discussion, and ABDELHAK, I would start with you. So we were saying the war in Ukraine has brought to the surface a dynamic that has been underway for some time in the Middle East and North Africa, namely this growing diversification of the regional countries' partnerships, as well as the consolidations of their relations with international players. Such as Russia and China, both in the military strategic domain and in the economic energy sector. So 1 year after the beginning of the war, how is the MENA region responding politically? Russia has been investing a lot, at least diplomatically, to keep the region neutral, but is the region really neutral?
I think in all the cases, the region displays neutrality. When you ask most of them, they say they are neutral. And even when you observe their behavior with the votes in the United Nations, neutrality is the main position adopted by the MENA region. But I think if we exclude Syria and Iran, who are openly supporting the Russia positions, in the other countries, I think we have three categories of positions. There's some countries that doesn't support Russia. They are not allies of Russia, but they don't want to create problems with Russia as a member of the UN Security Council. They display neutrality to avoid problem with Russia. Another category supports Russia on principle. They're ally of Russia, but they don't agree with some actions, such as the annexation of Ukraine territories by Russia. They display neutrality so as not to speak out against Russia. They support Russia when it comes to condemnation to the aggression, but they don't support Russia when it comes to the annexation. But they don't condemn the annexation openly. They just display neutrality. And there's some other countries who do not agree with Russia, but they don't agree with the West too. They have no reason to support the West. They have some grievances with the West. And then they display neutrality so as not to support the positions of the West. I think in the MENA countries, except Syria and Iran, countries act as neutral with regard to their interests, I think. It's a neutrality that serves their interests and not really a real neutrality.
I was about to provoke you on this, but you already answered. So it's kind of a neutrality that is useful somehow, needed.
Yes.
Of course. Thank you, ABDELHAK. INTISSAR neutrality doesn't, of course, apply in this specific case to the US. Clearly, the US-Russia competition has grown incredibly over the last year. Was this somehow evident in the MENA region as well? You know, while Russia has been quite heavily investing, as we said, at least diplomatically, in the region, throughout the region. On the other side, can we maybe talk of a renovated American policy or reinvigorated American policy in the MENA region in response to that, in response to Russia's diplomatic efforts, diplomatic interests, and not increased role, but consistent role?
Yeah. Thanks, Chiara. That's a good question, and in sort of attempting to answer it, what I want to do is maybe kind of step back a little bit and try to reflect more on sort of the broader dynamics. And I think here, I'll speak a little bit. A lot of what I'll say will probably be applicable to the Middle East in general, but I think, at least for me, for sort of my corner, my geographic corner, I think the idea that this sort of great power competition is playing out in the Middle East extends partially to the Maghreb region. Russia has had ties with North Africa, largely through, partnerships, military partnerships with Algeria for many decades. The bulk of Algerian military imports come from Russia. Of course, Russia has also been a decisive actor in the Libyan conflict using private military companies, particularly the Wagner Group. Of course, the use also of Russian NPC or PMCs has been well documented in other African contexts as well, beyond North Africa, the Sahel and Central Africa, of course. Having said that, I want to kind of make maybe two broader points that I think are true, certainly for the North African context, but I think a lot of them can also be true for the broader MENA region. First, I would argue that it's not really sort of competition in the sense that we might think about competition in sort of, for example, in the Cold War context. It's more that Russian influence has extended in some areas or increased perhaps in the absence of either strong US or EU presence. In some cases, it's sought to displace the EU presence. For example, here I'm thinking about Mali. Over the past year, and I think maybe even further than that, on certain issues, the issue has been trying to push back against Russia. For example, in Libya, on the presence of Wagner Group. Another example that you mentioned at the outset is the U.S. effort to secure support from North African nations for UN resolutions condemning Russian action in Ukraine. Of course, some of the early kind of, high-level visits that we saw by U.S. administration officials to Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. But I think to my first point about whether this sort of the kind of characterization of a competition is the best term, I would say that, for many regional partners, what Russia offers is very different and very distinct from what the EU and to some extent, the US and the EU, I think for the purposes of this conversation, we can lump them together from what they have to offer. It's the relationship with Russia is much more pragmatic, as ABDELHAK was alluding to, than ideological or sort of driven by kind of ideological affinity. I think the bottom line is that what Russia and what the US want are inherently different things, and I think the prevailing view in the administration is that when it comes to Russia's engagement in the region, Russia is more interested in sort of using that arena to play a spoiler, to kind of challenge the rule of law based international order to advance their interests. Second, and I think this is an important point to keep in mind, is from the perspective of the U.S., while Russia does present an immediate military threat, an immediate military challenge to Ukraine and Europe, I think the bigger concern from a U.S. foreign policy perspective is really the Chinese competition. That's really where the perception of true competition is. Russia, at least from the U.S. perspective, China plays a much more longer game that is perceived in the U.S. as sort of competing for spheres of influence. And I think perhaps we think the competition framing there might be more apt. If you look at the national security strategy that came out last October, you look at the framing and the language describing U.S. priorities, you'll see one of the priorities are essentially outcompeting China and containing Russia. So, the US views China as the only power with the right combination of tools, military or diplomatic, economic, and technological, that can essentially compete and reshape that in terms of reshaping the global order. It's articulated at a global scale, but if you also see it in specific strategies, for example, in the Africa strategy, which focuses more on sub-Saharan Africa, you can see it there. You asked, can we talk about a revamped U.S. foreign policy when it comes to the Middle East? I think, and I think maybe the broad outlines don't really change. If you look at the Biden administration's sort of big ticket items, it's going to be Iran and the nuclear issue. That's the predominant issue. Maybe the Israeli-Palestinian issue comes in at a second. North Africa does not really make it to the top of the agenda. There is interest in sort of, as I mentioned, making sure, at least kind of kicking out Wagner Group. But beyond that, there is some interest in promoting de-escalation between Morocco and Algeria, maybe trying to bring a little bit more the Western Sahara issue back to the negotiating table. But these are very small priorities. And more importantly, I don't think they are issues that the administration really wants to spend any meaningful capital on. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, INTISSAR. I like this perspective. So, to summarize in one word, if I understood correctly, containment on the
Exactly.
from the US side may be a better word to describe the US stance vis-a-vis Russia in the region, rather than competition. I like very much this perspective. Thank you for your explanation. And now let me turn to Julien BARNES-DACEY. Julien, over the past year, we witnessed there's been a lot of talk about this increased multipolarity of the MENA region, referring to the existence of different positions. Somehow we touched upon that, the fact that there was no a clear alignment with one or the other side of the war, but rather multiple views emerging from these countries. What is the place of Europe in this multipolarity of the region, since we are talking about the role of foreign actors in this complex scenario? How has the EU dialogue with the MENA region evolved throughout this complex year? What have been the main trajectories? What is the road ahead? Can you help us draw the picture in this sense?
Thank you, Chiara, and very nice to be with you again. The Europeans have struggled, I think, to adapt to what's happening in the region and the region within a kind of shifting global order. You know, obviously, when one talks about kind of new regional multipolarity and the kind of shifts of power there, none of that is directly, or that's not all directly because of what happened in Ukraine, and that's a longer term trajectory that we've seen as the US has in a sense repositioned itself with a lower degree of assertiveness and attempts to shape the regional order. As regional players themselves have stepped up, as the East, as Russia and China have moved in more. I mean, all of this has been something that's been going on for a long time and has left a Europe that has traditionally seen its role as being aligned and dependent very much on US leadership in a region that almost kind of naturally was seen as leaning towards the West. Suddenly that's kind of been thrust aside, and there has been a need for Europeans to actually wake up and say, well, hang on a second, the Americans aren't shaping things any longer. The region no longer looks to us in the same way. And how are we going to advance our very real interests in terms of regional stability, in terms of energy needs and so on and so forth. And obviously Ukraine very much accelerated that. We have seen, I mean, ABDELHAK kind of referred to it as neutrality. You know, in Europe, neutrality in a sense has meant not being aligned with what they see as a kind of ideological kind of war against Russia, which cannot be allowed to stand, and in a very much kind of black and white sense. And at the same time, we've seen kind of China increasingly doing more in the year and in the year since Ukraine. So it's been a shifting region in which Europe has needed to think to itself, how can we step up? How can we assert our own interests? The region doesn't see us as a strategic actor. We don't bring significant strategic weight to the region. And at the same time, Europe coming to the region and saying, but you know what, we're also going to be more dependent on you than ever before. We need your energy, and we need it quick. And I think that has fundamentally created a real mismatch in terms of the desire for a new kind of strategic focus, strategic autonomy, Europe standing up for its place in the global order, saying this is what our regional neighborhood should look like. One in which those principles are very much applied to Ukraine, in which there is a kind of black and white narrative of what Europe stands for and represents. And on the other hand, saying, we are incredibly dependent on you. We need your energy, and you know what? Let's be transactional today, because we don't have time and we don't have the political space to talk about kind of what real stability would look like, what a balanced relationship would look like. Actually, just here and now, we need your energy. And so I think Europe has very much been caught in that dilemma, and effectively has also adopted a containment approach to the Middle East, saying that our priority, our focus is Ukraine, is a war with Russia. We don't need more problems in the Middle East. We don't want to be contesting the legitimacy of authoritarian states. We don't want them to threaten us with cutting off their oil. And so that's where I think we find ourselves today, and Europe has adopted that position. I think what we haven't really spent much time thinking about is the kind of secondary effect that you mentioned at the beginning, and how that will play out and play into the nature of our relations with some of the regional states. We do see a profound social economic crisis building in the region. It's food security, it's inbuilt economic kind of structural problems that are feeding immense inflationary pressures. We see regime elites co-opting political economies, and all of these are building up a degree of tension and pressures that I think is very much coming into to kind of direct contact with this idea of containment and a transactional policy that Europe has adopted. And I'm not sure where we go forward in terms of the trajectory. I think it's going to be a very difficult period for the region going forward. I think it's going to be a very difficult period for Europe going forward once it realizes that actually stability isn't going to be maintained in the same way in the south that it might have hoped for. And all of this is therefore, is undoubtedly unfolding in what you call a more kind of multipolar region in which Europe is less able to assert itself, is less able to rely on the US. So it's a complicated region. We can go into a lot of these elements. We haven't really talked about China. We haven't really talked about the way in which the regional actors are asserting their own interests in a way that doesn't align with what the West wants. But happy to stop there and just concede the point that the Europeans are very much struggling within this new kind of regional context of a contested global order.
Yeah, of course, you're right, Julien. It would be an issue of time to adapt to this changing context. And ABDELHAK, I would go back to you because Julien was mentioning, of course, the energy dossier, and this brings to the surface some regional context, of course, the Gulf, but also the Maghreb, North African states that emerge as preferred doors for us Europeans to get non-Russian energy sources. So can you help us get a picture? You were talking about the MENA region's neutrality in general before. Can you please go perhaps a bit more in depth on the North African context, North African states' position vis-a-vis the war, and maybe perhaps Morocco's position in particular, since you are from the region of the Maghreb. Thank you.
Yes, I think the landscape in North Africa is the same. That's for the MENA region, and I think we are always in the three categories. If you check Morocco, by example, Morocco may maintain normal relations with Russia, but Morocco is not an ally of Russia. When it comes to the votation in the United Nations, for 3 times, Morocco was absent. And 1 time, he voted in favor of the resolution condemning the annexation of the Ukrainian territories. From this, what is the Moroccan position? The Moroccan position is we don't agree what is happening. We don't want problems with Russia, but we are against the annexation of territories because I think that the territorial integrity is something that is really important to the Moroccan doctrine. Now we have in North Africa some countries that are allies of Russia, such as Algeria. Algeria is pro-Russian. But when you look at the votation in the United Nations, when it comes to the annexation of the Ukrainian territory, Algeria has abstained, even if it's an ally of Russia. What does it mean? Algeria said, yes, Russia is our ally, but we don't agree with the annexation. If you take Egypt, for example, in Egypt, they say what? We are allies, we have been ally of Russia, we are always friend with Russia, we are always ally of the West, but we have nothing to win, neither with the West and with Russia. Then they abstain, as if saying, we have nothing to do with this, except when it comes to wet importations and energy, we have no interest. And I think even in the North Africa or in the MENA region, the three categories of behavior are the same.
Yeah, thank you, ABDELHAK. Thank you for these ideas. I would ask INTISSAR now if she could, aim to get into the political side of the story. So I don't want to ask two specific questions on energy, but energy relations are political relations too. So we're mentioning these, of course, not new, but increased energy partnerships between Europe and North Africa and the Gulf states as well. What opportunities did these new partnerships provide the North Africa? And if you would like to expand on the Gulf states as well, you're more than welcome. What opportunities this new partnership provided these states with, and what challenges? Because of course it's more complicated than it looks.
Yeah, it certainly is. I mean, you asked about opportunities and challenges, and I want to really just take this opportunity to emphasize what Julien said about the toll of economic hardship and the economic fragility that we are seeing just compounded in the region. And this is something, of course, that applies primarily to energy importers. But even within energy exporters, you have places where there is significant pockets of economic fragility. And I think the long-term impact of that, could have some serious consequences for basically stability. So that's definitely an area that's worth watching. Specifically on the question of energy, I think the immediate opportunities or gains that have been really mostly for gas and oil producers, and let me start with North Africa and sort of see where time takes us. But I think there, Algeria really stands out. It's the more reliable and stable gas and energy producer to Europe, a little bit more so than Libya in the region. And I think there, Algeria has been able to reemerge as an important geopolitical actor, as you mentioned. Energy is a huge part of geopolitics because of the reliability of its gas supplies to Europe. It's been able to expand its partnerships, and while the country is, never really going to be able to compete with Russian supplies, it has been able to offset some of that shortage, especially for Italy. Algeria has been able to increase its supplies the past few years. And the big question, I think, within the industry has been, whether Algeria can maintain and potentially increase some of this sort of basically bumper production that we have seen over the past year. I think last year, the estimates of Algeria's exports were at 49.3 billion cubic meter. Now, it's important to keep in mind that this is roughly half of what the country produces, because the other half is taken up by domestic energy consumption. And the figure that I just gave for last year was for 2022 was down from 54.6 billion cubic meters from 2021, which is, as I mentioned, was the bumper year. Again, aside from questions about meaningful increase in its supplies, I think Algeria has been able to benefit from this moment in terms of increased gas revenue. The revenue has not only gone to sort of help put off some of the belt tightening measures that the state was contending with prior to the increase in gas prices, but also to increase spending. The state has now the fiscal room to increase domestic spending, to invest more, to rebuild its reserves. That's pretty much the traditional way that the state has always kind of spent the income from energy. Another thing might be sort of an opportunity for Algeria to try and restructure some of these gas contracts with an eye on ensuring more investment in infrastructure, because right now the market is a little bit more conducive for that, whereas a few years ago there wasn't really the room for Algeria to negotiate on those things. For Libya, I think for future investment, until now, I would say that most international actors are still not willing to take the risk that the country's political situation entails. We saw, the signing of an upstream deal between Italy and Libya. Not sure where that stands at the moment, given the political situation. And more important, I don't think that that's necessarily an indication that other European partners have the same appetite for risk. As I mentioned early on, there are efforts on the U.S. to try and sort of limit on the U.S.'s side to try and limit some disruptions to oil supply. But I'm not sure really to what extent that sort of decreases the vulnerability of the sector. And then one last point that I would make, which is, that the crisis also, in a way, in addition to what Julien said about sort of the very kind of urgent need for gas right now, it raises the importance of investing in renewables. And I think maybe, we can talk a little bit more about this, but I think, while the outlook very much remains on energy transition and renewable energy, the moment right now is so focused on securing gas supplies that it almost sort of diverts attention away from the work that needs to be put into renewables, at least on the surface. And I can stop there. I don't want to go on for too long.
Thank you, INTISSAR. Very interesting as well. It helps me to get back to Julien, actually. Julien, INTISSAR was referring to these, as she said, different appetites for risk that European countries may have when dealing with the MENA region. She was referring specifically to the energy sector and energy search for energy security. Do you agree with her? And how do you think the European partners are responding to these very big challenges that are displaying in the current time in the region?
Sure. Well, I think INTISSAR is absolutely right. There is very little risk appetite when it comes to kind of European focus and consideration of how to approach the southern neighborhood. Europe essentially has a big need, which is energy, and it's got a political vulnerability given the fight that it's waging in Ukraine. And it does not want to see the southern boat rocked. It does not want to have a challenging and contested relationship with states that have both emerged as key energy suppliers, but also could be sources of quite significant instability. And so I think the general response has been one of not looking to challenge the region in any meaningful way, but to accept the kind of regional terms of engagement at this time, and to lock in the kind of necessary economic energy and stability interests that Europe sees as its immediate priority. So in a sense, I think it is a similar policy of containment as has been mentioned elsewhere. I mean, in another moment, whether it would have been kind of in the post-Arab Spring or in the immediate years of the post-Arab Spring or without Ukraine, I think Europe might perhaps be focused on a lot of other issues. It might be prepared to think a bit more about the kind of structural challenges that are feeding the immense economic problems we're seeing right across the region. As we see economic breakdown in Syria and Lebanon and Egypt and Tunisia, I think there may have been in the past a greater willingness to really focus, and particularly not so much on a country like Syria, but on some of the others that are effectively our allies. There would have been more of a willingness to address structural changes. But at this moment in time, that isn't the case. It's about ensuring that the boat is not rocked. And I think that those countries in particular that do have energy resources know that they have leverage over Europe at this time, and they have not been hesitant to use that. And that applies to the likes of the Arab Gulf states. It applies to Algeria. We see non-energy leverage in terms of Morocco and its willingness to kind of deploy migration cards and the migration card against the Spanish and the Germans and others, and link that to Western Sahara. So all of these countries see a vulnerable Europe, a weakened Europe, a Europe that is not focused on the southern neighborhood, and are looking to exploit it. I think the question that's really left hanging, though, is how sustainable is that? Do things go pop at one moment? Do some of these social economic challenges provoke new destabilizing or migratory pressures on Europe that force the bloc to adapt in a different way. So let me stop there, but I think that kind of risk factor is very clear when you put the region in contrast to what Europeans and the degree of risk that they're prepared to accept in Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Julien. Our audience has been quite shy. We just have a couple of questions, so I will combine them with a couple of others that I had in mind. I should ask you to be very brief, 1 minute answer each. And I would start with you, ABDELHAK. We mentioned a lot of key actors that have been emerging in this scenario of global war that has been impacting the MENA region as well. What is up with Turkey? What is your assessment of Turkey as being one of the most vocal and present player during this time? How do you evaluate Turkey's diplomatic role? In 1 minute, please.
I think Turkey is playing well the role that corresponds to its geopolitical and geographical position. Turkey is geographically equidistant between Russia and Europe and the West. And even geopolitically, Turkey is equidistant between the two. Turkey is member of the NATO. Turkey is in Europe, but Turkey is not fully integrated by the West. And Turkey has some interest with Russia in the Black Sea, sometimes such as tourism. She has interest with Russia in Syria. Then Turkey is in the middle between the two parts. That allows her to play some mediation role, and I think Turkey plays well.
Thank you, ABDELHAK, for being so clear and brief as well. INTISSAR, there is a question from the audience about the role of China. I think you were talking about China before, and you spoke, of course, about the presence and the interests, especially economic interests, that the country has in the Middle East and North Africa. The question from the audience is whether these status of war has provided China with greater opportunities, with a window for playing a greater role than the one that it already had. Please, INTISSAR, in 1 minute as well.
No, I think certainly. I think the way in which we have seen Chinese investment and outreach grow, globally through the Belt and Road Initiative, certainly plays in North Africa as well. I think it's really interesting if you look at the extent to which Chinese economic cooperation is significant in places like Algeria. There is a lot of investment in infrastructure. There is a lot of investment in really some of the key sectors. If you look at, for example, I think this will give you a pretty good sense. If you look at, for example, Morocco's trade, obviously the EU remains one of the key sort of trading partners for Morocco. But if you dig a little bit deeper and you look at, for example, imports, the bulk of Moroccan imports, I think China has recently so the first is Spain. But China has recently edged out France as the second largest, exporter to Morocco. So this gives you a little sense of the extent to which Chinese engagement. It's a different kind of engagement, as I mentioned. It's engagement that is not that doesn't rely on this kind of ideological affinity. It's an engagement that's much more practical. It's an engagement that's much more transactional. And so in many ways, you will find it probably more palatable on the part of these regional partners. And at the very least, it also allows a lot of these regional partners to gain a little bit more of an ability to sort of say to key players like Europe and the EU to say, you're no longer the only game in town. There is China, there is Russia, there is Turkey. There are other actors with whom we can develop powerful relationships. So you can't you can't expect to have the same degree of influence that you have had in the past. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Inti. Thank you as well for being brief and clear. There is Russia, there is Turkey, there is Iran as well, and that I wanted to ask about to Julien. We were talking about this overall general neutrality of the Middle East and North African region, with exception of a couple of countries that sided openly with Moscow, and one of these is Iran. So, we know about the military cooperation, the sending of drones and missiles to Russia from the side of Iran. What political weight do the Russia-Iran relations bear for Europe first, and what implications do they bear, especially on the nuclear deal? Will they, get the possibility of the nuclear deal to be further discussed, even far away? Thank you. 1 minute as well, sorry.
Sure. So I think, the Russia-Iran relationship is something that is seen in very concerning ways in Europe, and also in the region, by the way. I think there's a lot of concern that what's happening in Ukraine, and actually one of the reasons why some regional states aren't fully aligning with the West, is a desire to try and avoid pushing the Russians completely into an alliance with Russia. With Iran. This is obviously an area of massive concern. Europeans are very worried by the threat of Iranian weapons being used by the Russians in Ukraine. We've seen drones, and there's been talk of advisors, and there's talk of possible missiles. In many ways, I think this is the issue that is tipping the Europeans over the edge in terms of how they engage with and think about Iran. There's 3 different baskets of issues that have been going in very much the wrong direction. There's the nuclear front, where the talks have been hitting a dead end. Iran has been progressing with its nuclear development. There's the protests and the repressive response of the Iranian regime. Both of those baskets, Europe has obviously taken a strong position against. But the thing that's pushing, I think, Europe into a more overtly confrontational, hostile position towards Tehran is its willingness to support Russia in a war that Europeans see as happening in their own theater, in their own backyard. And that's something that has really pushed a lot of people who are willing to give Iran the benefit of the doubt in some capacity, or who are willing at least to say, you know what, we don't like the Iranian system, we don't like what they represent, we don't like what they do at home, but we need to maintain some kind of diplomatic channels because regionally had too big of a footprint, because we need to find a diplomatic agreement to the nuclear deal. The Ukraine issue, I think, is squeezing those people quite significant. And I think it's really been the key impediment to a more hostile position within Europe, where actually you see a lot more governments turning against diplomacy. You see this symbolized by talk of potential terrorist designation of the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards. And I do think that at this stage, it seems that there is very little prospect of the nuclear deal being revived. But certainly, if you were to see any more Iranian military support for the Russians in Ukraine, that would be an absolute impossibility, and we'd see a much more hostile European response going forward.
Yeah, you are the expert, but I do agree very much with you. Before closing, wrapping up, I know INTISSAR would like to say something about specifically short comments about Russia-Algeria relations specifically, and how Algeria has been balancing politically between Russia and the West, its cooperation with Europe and cooperation with Russia as well. INTISSAR, if you can do that in 30 seconds, that would be great.
30 seconds, I will try. Yeah, no, I think it's an important point, because I think it might have some interesting, either parallels or things to sort of keep in mind. Because I think when you look around the region, this is a particular relationship. It's not, it's not a relationship that is as purely sort of opportunistic as let's say, Russia has with Libya, for example. But I think it's really interesting to sort of see, and I think there's a lot of parallels here that can also be drawn from, Morocco's position and other countries that have assumed this sort of, pseudo neutrality, if you want to call it that. One of the things that we know about the Algerian, and I think this is also a question that comes up a lot in the context of, talking about energy cooperation, and could this lead to some kind of broader realignment? I think one of the things that we know about Algeria is that it has sort of a very principled foreign policy approach. In that sense, it's very difficult to kind of imagine or to see Algerian military cooperation with Russia changing immediately, or even sort of and curiosity maybe in the region. So the first thing, as I said, would be, a potential shift within the military sort of leadership direction within Algeria. That is to say, if there are more sort of pro-EU, pro-West voices within the military and civilian leadership, that can kind of, impact a little bit this relationship. But I think the second is a more interesting one, and potentially more consequential, is, whether or maybe to what extent can Russian military industrial production continue to satisfy Algerian arms needs? In other words, can Russia keep up with both the current Ukrainian conflict and supply both the volume and the quality of arms that traditional, partners, like, for example, Algeria would want? I think the quality of arms is an important point here, and it raises, another question. Does Algeria, do other partners of Russia around the globe, do they, remain convinced of the superiority and efficacy of Russia's technological arms and technological power? And more specifically, at what point does this conviction change, and what does this do to these old military ties around the region?
Thank you, INTISSAR. Very much agree. The issue of the sustainability of Russia's cooperation, military cooperation with these countries, I think doesn't apply just to Algeria, but to many other contexts. But thank you for raising that very important point. I am sorry, I have to wrap up and conclude because we are running out of time. Thank you very much, ABDELHAK, JULIEN, and INTISSAR for the fruitful thoughts that you gave us, and we'll nurture further discussions, I'm sure, with all of you. And I should tell that next week, on Thursday 23 at 3 p.m. Central European Time, we are hosting the second event in cooperation with the MEI and Policy Center for the New South. So stay tuned. See you there. Thank you very much to our guests, ABDELHAK, JULIEN, and INTISSAR, and I will see you soon. And thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Take care.